Here is an animal without turbinate bones, an alligator. Here's an animal with turbinate bones. And so you can see nasal cavity, nasal cavity. What they do is when the animal inhales, the air flows over those, and remember the air is heading into those lungs. So the air flows over those, it gets moistened, because the lungs are very sensitive tissue, and we don't want that dry air hitting them. So the air gets moistened, and it gets warmed up. It goes down into the lungs, gas exchange occurs, and then the air comes back out, passes over them again. If he's breathing through his nose, he does. And the moisture, at least some of it, gets reabsorbed or gets picked up again by those turbinate bones, so you're not exhaling as much moisture. And some of the heat gets retained as that air flows over those bones. So they act as one of those counter-current systems in a manner, a conservation mechanism. We're conserving heat, we're conserving water. So what this is a sign of endothermy. We're doing a lot of breathing now. The lungs are expansive, and we're pulling a lot of air in and out of them. The turbinate bone's warming that air up, moistening it first. That's a good thing for anybody, but it's a sign of endothermy. And as those nasal chambers get larger, we look at that faucet and say, okay, this guy is maybe fully functional endothermic or maybe heading in that direction. I found this great picture of a polar bear showing you the effect of that. And polar bears, the nasal cavity of polar bears is enormous compared to a tropical bear. We need to get a polar bear skull for that. Another little bit of anatomy that may be a little bit more subtle is in cynodonts, we start to see the lumbar ribs. And these are the ribs down here. The lumbar region, towards the bottom part of the back end of the rib cage. These ribs start to become reduced and disappear eventually. You don't have them. That suggests diaphragm breathing. Having ribs down here, which you don't have, would interfere with diaphragm breathing. So that's another clue to warm-bloodedness, the very efficient diaphragm breathing. So on a whole, cynodonts probably had hair, probably were endothermic, at least partially. And those are some traits we consider to be modern mammalian traits, but they probably show up in cynodonts. And there's just cute pictures of them. Yeah, I had new batteries. There we go. Okay, well, let's transition to mammals. This would be class Mammalia. In a classification sense, mammals are advanced cynodonts. A little bit of maybe technical detail we don't need. And here we go. Here are the advanced mammals. I have them highlighted here. There's three major groups. We'll play with those in a few minutes. And here's traits we associate with them. Some of these traits may have shown up a little bit earlier, but nothing alive shows this particular array of traits. Some of these things might have been happening down here, but let's have a look. Here's a very early mammal, an early Jurassic mammal. Get an idea, poor little guy, someone sent a paperclip back in a time machine so he could sit next to it. But very small, little insectivorous mammal. So mammals have hair. Hair almost certainly evolved in conjunction with warm-bloodedness, endothermic. As these animals went endothermic, okay, we're now burning energy to keep our elevated body temperature. Hair is an insulator, just same thing with feathers. So, of all the living animals, only mammals have hair and all mammals have hair. Hair comes associated with all sorts of glands to maintain it, to keep it healthy. And so the skin becomes actually more complex. A similar thing happened in birds too, but the associated skin glands come along with hair. And we're going to touch those later. Those lead to things. And there's a slice through mammalian skin. somewhat more complex than, say, reptile skin, even bird skin. We have the hair and then various types of glands to maintain that hair. Next thing is mammary glands. Mammary glands is the cutoff point. We don't know exactly where they show up in the fossil record, but if we knew what that animal was, that animal's a mammal. That's the key synapomorphy for mammalia, is mammary glands. And mammary glands are modified sebaceous glands. Sebaceous are these oil glands. These are modified to produce that nutrient material we call milk. The dentition of modern mammals is more complex, and so I thought we'd spend a few slides on that. Modern mammalian dentition, and there's a few aspects of it that are worth looking at. It's heterodont, aggressively heterodont. Now, starting with Pelechosaurs, we had canine teeth. Heterodont means all the teeth aren't exactly the same. Heterodont, right? Different teeth. And we've had canine teeth for a long time, but with modern mammals, we get incisors, we get molars, and the canine teeth. We get a variety of teeth in different parts of the mouth for different functions. New battery. And that's a big deal because diapsids and fishes certainly and amphibians have homodont dentition for the most part. Every tooth is pretty much the same as every other tooth, and it's mammals that have this diversification. Diphodont. Di means two, right? Dont means teeth. I'm not sure what bio means here in this case, but what this means is we have two sets of teeth, and that's the case with most mammals. You have your baby teeth and your adult teeth, and you don't get any more. And alligators and certainly fishes and a lot of diapsids, if you break a tooth or lose it, another one grows back. That doesn't happen in mammals. I'm not sure if there was an adaptive reason for that or we just did something stupid in our past, but we can't regrow teeth once we lose them. Oh, wrong way. And we saw this in lab when we looked at some of those skulls. Particularly, and I use the mountain lion skull as a good example. Our teeth occlude very precisely. Either they come together for grinding surfaces, or they pass each other like scissors, cutting teeth. And we don't see that in diapsids. We don't see that nearly to the same extent in fishes. We have these precisely occluding teeth, very specific functions now. That's a tool for slicing through tendons and muscle, like a pair of shears. I had a tooth, one of my lower incisors. Was it lower? I can't remember now. One of my incisors fell out of place. Apparently it happens. I didn't know that, and it just pushed forward, and I went to the orthodontist and got a retainer at age 56. Had one of those retainers like you all had when you were 12. And I had no idea your teeth move around. My teeth are all shifted around now, and they don't occlude nearly like they used to. They don't. I used to be able to bite my fingernails. I can't anymore because I don't have the precision. So anyway, that's just my personal experience with precisely occluding teeth. Now, this is a big deal, so I want to walk through this. It's kind of involved, but I think it's kind of interesting, and we don't do a lot of intense anatomy in this class, so I thought we would here. I reworked this part actually right before class. So if you printed off the old version, I have a new version now to upload it. But what we're going to see here is we're going to see a rearrangement of the jaw articulation. Now, the jaw articulation is where the lower jaw meets the skull. Let's just define those things. Lower jaw, I'm not talking about any specific bone, we're just talking about the lower jaw, thing that swings, and the skull, that's the upper part of the head. And that's the articulation point. And we see a rearrangement of that, and we see the bones, some of the bones that are involved in that articulation taking on new functions. So in this slide here, this is old, and Pelechosaur, that's Dimetrodon, okay? That's an early synapsid, and top left is a modern mammal, that's you, okay? Let's look at some of this here. So, mainly what we're looking at here is in a mammal, your lower jaw is one bone, it's the dentary, one bone, your whole lower jaw, and its hinge point on the skull is a bone called the squamosal. And we heard you play with the skulls in lab, the mammal skulls, like the bear skull. There's that little condyle there, that little hinge point, and the bone on the skull that touched is the squamosal. So that is the modern mammal. The lower jaw is one chunk, one bone, and it articulates with a bone called the squamosal. Okay, that's what you do. And that's a strong, robust construction. They're not very flexible, though. So the old-fashioned jaw, the squamosal is not involved at all. It's yellow here. And there's a bunch of bones in the back of the lower jaw. The dentary is only the front part of the lower jaw. There's a bunch of bones back here. And so what we see from old to new, from old to modern, we see a simplification of that structure. Let's look at that. We see elements jumping out of place. We see elements taking on more importance in the newer forms than the older forms. The second part of this is, look at the color coding here. The purple and the brown, or the, what is that, orange? Follow it up there. Some of these jaw bones become the inner ear bones. So that's the repurposing of elements. We see a simplification of the structure, and some of the bones that were involved in the articulation, they're right back here by the inner ear. They lose their articulation function, and they migrate inside and become inner ear bones. So two things happen in there. So there's a fish skull, all right? Here's that dentary. There's the lower jaw there. Here's the skull up here. Look at all this stuff between the dentary and the skull. That's what we're playing with here. We got 3 extra bones on the lower jaw. We got 3 or 4 extra bones, depending on what kind of fish you're looking at, between the skull and the articulation point. You go straight from here to here. All this stuff in you is gone. So, let's see. This is the difference there. So, there's the articulation point, there's the skull. There's the articulation point, there's the skull. That's a fish. This is a primitive synapsid. So, we're seeing this stuff simplified, this stuff simplified. And we see key elements get repurposed. First bone we repurpose. This is the fish skull. The bone actually touching the skull is a bone right here called the hyomandibula. The details aren't important, but I'm hoping the pattern is of interest. Okay? And there's the dentary way down there. But that's the actual connection to the skull through a bunch of other bones down to the lower jaw. Step 1. The hyomandibula gets a new function. That's the fish way of doing things. The hyomandibula gets a new function. And its new function is that first inner ear bone. It loses its role in the articulation, migrates to the inside, and it becomes that first inner ear bone, which we call the columella, which we met before and we looked at in lab. That one little inner ear bone, remember? Okay. That is evolutionarily derived from this thing here. And the inner ear is right inside there. It's positioned right to do that. By the time we get to tetrapods, this bone is not involved in the jaw articulation. It's in the inner ear. And I think I have pictures of it. There's a primitive synapsid like the dimetrodon. And there's that columella. There's the inner ear. There's the eardrum. That's that little bone right there. And in some of the skulls we had in the lab, you could see it hanging right there. So the lower jaw would be hanging off down here. So we call it the columella now, not the hyomandibula. In fish, it's a hyomandibula. Once we get to tetrapods, it's a columella. In you, it's the stapes, but we'll get there in a little bit. So this construction, this is a turtle skull. In this construction, we see amphibians, all diapsids, and non-mammalian synapsids, everything up to mammals. That's the primitive tetrapod way to do things. And all tetrapods except mammals do it this way. Mammals take it another step. We good so far? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, that's a hyomandibula. We're done with that little guy now. This is a fish skull again. We go down here, there's 2 more bones to play with. Here's one called the quadrate. And that's actually, this is the jaw here. The lower jaw goes like this. This is the hinge of the lower jaw. The lower jaw goes like this. There's the dentary way up here again. So there's the quadrate connecting to up through the skull there. And there's a bone on the back end of the dentary called the articular. It's where the articulation occurs. All right? So there it is. On the back end, there's a primitive synapsid. There's the articular. There it is. There it is. There it is. The quadrate is up on the skull. It's the articulation point with the articular. As we move from primitive synapsid to more advanced synapsid, up the chain we go. These two bones lose their role in the articulation. The dentary takes over the articulation. It starts connecting directly with the skull. The dentary in brown here starts articulating directly with the skull. And these little guys lose out. But they're right here back by the inner ear. And they migrate interiorly, and they become the second two mammal inner ear bones. So the quadrate and the articular lose their role in the jaw hinge, and they're just hanging there right by the inner ear, and get pushed into the inner ear and become ear bones. And you know that, right? You have 3 inner ear bones, right? Malleus, stapes, incus. I can't always keep them straight. The lower jaw, which is the dentary, let's put it another way. The lower jaw becomes the dentary. And these extra bones in the back of the lower jaw lose their roles. And so instead of the lower jaw swinging against a series of bones, we see a trend towards the lower jaw articulating directly with the skull, which it does in you. And so all this junk back here, we lose or repurpose. And the bone on the skull that we hinge against is called the squamosal, because we need that. We need to give it a name. Okay? So here's the fish version. There's these, and these are the inner ear bones. The first one shows up in early tetrapods. The hyomandibula loses its role and becomes the columella. And then later, the quadrate and the articular lose their role in the hinge, and the dentary goes straight to the skull. And the columella becomes the stapes, and mammals are called the stapes. The quadrate becomes the incus in mammals, and the articular becomes the malleus. So here's the primitive tetrapod condition. One inner ear bone, the columella, which is the hyomandibula, or in you it's the stapes. And here's the mammal ear. Gotta get oriented here. There's the eardrum. There's those 3 inner ear bones. The columella is the first one, the stapes. And then mammals add these 2 later ones. So how silly is that? And overly complicated, huh? So, proto-mammal, like Dimetrodon, mammal. We still have the bones in the back of the dentary. We still have a complicated multi-bone hinge here. By the time we get to mammals, dentary goes right to the skull. And that junk at the back end, some of it's just gone. And 3 of those bones become inner ear bones. Questions? Okay. Well, I rearranged this morning. If you download, I'll post this new version. We're going to go in here. So there's the fish version of a jaw. There's a mammal. This is the dentary. This whole bone here, it's a single bone here. And there's the squamosal right there. And there's the hinge right there. And those 3 bones that were formerly associated with the hinge are now in here, in the inner ear. So you can see there's a geographic proximity there. Those bones were right here. They just got repurposed right where they were into a new function. Questions? Well, that's not jaw stuff. Interesting parallel. I think I touched this before, but let's touch it again. There's proto-birds. There's proto-mammals, right? They're on vastly distant portions of our evolutionary tree. Archosaur diapsids, synapsids. As we go from proto-mammals to mammals, we see endothermy developing, and we see associated traits, things like hair and a powerful metabolism. And once you get a powerful metabolism, you need a good circulatory system to move the blood around. And you need a good respiratory system to extract the oxygen from the air. So we see respiration, circulation, diet. You need to eat higher quality food. That shows up here in the line leading towards mammals. We see a very similar set of changes in the group leading toward birds. Instead of hair, we get feathers. But we also get that powerful metabolism. We get a circulatory system increasing in efficiency. The bird circulatory system in some ways is very similar to a mammal circulatory system, but it's independently derived. Two different evolutionary events. And a very different respiratory system in birds than mammals. So both lineages adapting into the same kind of niche, similar parallel developments. What do we call that?
Convergent
evolution. Yeah, great example. Okay, finally we're up at mammals. Class Mammalia. We're focusing mostly on living things now. We haven't got any more fossil things to look at. Class Mammalia, in the strict sense, in the modern sense. So early mammals, well, we've got a few more fossil things, high reconstruction. Early mammals were mostly rather small. And we're talking about Triassic here, before dinosaurs. They were probably nocturnal. They're probably burrowing. Burrowing promotes certain kinds of anatomies. Nocturnal promotes certain kinds of sensory apparatus. So these are important in the early foundation of mammals, and I've made this point before. You can look at a group like mammals or birds or primates or whatever, and you can look at the diversity of things we have today, and you can track back to the ancestor, and you still see imprints of the ancestor, millions and millions of years later. And better example, you've got chordate traits. I mean, that first chordate was 500 million years ago, and you've got aspects of that chordate anatomy still in you. So these are the kind of things that set the pattern. So we start to see these little burrowing, probably nocturnal creatures. We're seeing their dietary niche diversify. The early ones are probably little carnivores, insectivores, probably like a shrew, if anything alive today. And we see the dietary niche diversify. We see herbivory showing up, plant eating. We see tooth diversification. That's our first clue that the diet is diversifying. Think about living at night in the dark. Vision becomes less important to you. You're going to see, and you want to be able to see during the day, and so your eyes do get maybe a little more acute and function better in the dark. But the non-visual senses become more acute. And mammals, we went with olfaction and hearing, but olfaction. And human primates, we are not extremely olfactory oriented. I mean, you can smell your neighbor on an airliner if he sits down and has been eating pizza or something, or curry. You can smell that. But we are not nearly as sensitive as most other mammals, as human primates. And an awful lot about early mammal evolution is about smell, the sensory system at least, and hearing. And again, as human primates, we have a pretty good sense of hearing. I damaged mine, as I've told you, but I don't hear it near as well as we used to. That's why I have to ask you to repeat yourselves in the lab sometimes. But we are hearing specialists. And those are the senses that work well at night. Hearing specializations. That 3 inner ear business, that 3 inner ear bone business, is about hearing precision. Night vision is there, but let's think about night vision. It's not like night vision like you see Navy SEALs when everything's like ghosty. Mammals do what they can with the low light situations, natural low light situations. And so in your eyes, you have rods and cones in your eyes, and I can never keep them straight. Does anyone remember which one does color and which one does? I can't remember. Rod's about color and cones about
cones are color. Rods is like
okay. So you got those two sensory. Let's just say the two sensory things. One's about color. One's about general light. And most mammals are balanced towards the light one and away from the color one. Most mammals don't see color really well. Color's not an aspect of light at night. You see things. Think about when you're out at night. If it's just moonlight, you're not seeing a lot of color. There's not a lot of colored light. So most mammals, their retina are balanced more towards seeing light, period, not in color. Vision specialists like primates and squirrels, oddly enough, see in color. But most other mammals apparently don't. And it wasn't an issue because at night, it's not part of their environment. So anyway, these things appear early in the Mesozoic, maybe even, probably started appearing in the Permian, but certainly by the Triassic we had mammals. And for most of the Mesozoic, mammals are fairly minor players. The diversity is there, we find the fossils, they're mostly smallish and mostly nocturnal. And think about some aspects of that niche. We had a huge diversity of fairly large, nasty carnivores, and many of these were probably ectothermic, cold-blooded, or at least partially ectothermic, although we think the theropods went warm-blooded. But we had a big diversity of predators that probably were not as active at night because it was colder. And cold-blooded things slow down when it gets colder. And so these guys ruled the night, and these guys had the daylight niches. And mammals stayed fairly minor, a component of the ecosystem. At the end of the Cretaceous, that tertiary Cretaceous juncture point, we talked about this. We had that big horrible afternoon on our planet where nearly everything went extinct. Again, thought to have been ushered in by a fairly large meteor strike. And all this big stuff disappeared. I think I've had that cartoon up there. I just like that one. Save yourself, mammal. I like it. I like this one too. Just me. So there's the Cretaceous, the last of the era of big diapsids. And there's the Tertiary. And a lot of things didn't make it through that event, but what did are mammals and theropod dinosaurs in the form of birds and some other stuff. But if the terrestrial tetrapods, all the big stuff disappears. And we end up with tuataras, snakes, and lizards, right? Mammals and birds. And this is a very telling evolutionary chart here. These are different types of mammals. This is the mammal diversity today, and times on the vertical axis. And so we take these things back into the fossil record. That's that event 65 million years ago. That's the end of the Mesozoic. And these are the mammal groups that are known to have occurred at that point in time. 20 million years later, look at the increased number of mammalian groups we have. And some people look at this and say, well, this is an example of adaptive radiation. Well, adaptive radiation. Suddenly, at this point in time, all those diapsids had the niches, particularly the daytime niches. Those niches became open suddenly. And who was around to take them? Birds and mammals. And mammals diversified into those niches, adaptive radiation. And so we get stuff like this. So there's our evolutionary tree with time on it. These are the groups we have today. We have three big groups today, or three groups today, not necessarily big, but we go back in time, and this is great for moving your finger, and you can push it back in time. Mammals, in the strict sense, probably show up in the Triassic. Silents linger on for a while. Therapsids not as far as that. Oral Paleosaurs disappear by the end of the Paleozoic. But there's that radiation since the end of the Mesozoic. And here's what we have today. We have three major groups of mammals with us today. Modern ones, it's the biggest group by far, like 99% of the mammals are in this group here. We've got a smaller group of semi-primitive mammals and then a tiny group of incredibly primitive mammals. And these are the defining traits, at least for the living ones. So here's mammals, and here's some things about them. Mammals are endothermic, truly endothermic, warm-blooded. Mammals have hair. Now, amongst living animals, mammals are the only ones with hair, but we think hair goes further back into the fossil record, the evolutionary time. But if you have hair, you're a mammal. And these two things are almost certainly linked. As mammals started to go endothermic, hair became the insulatory material of choice. And remember, in the therapsid dinosaur, the theropod dinosaur lineage, feathers were the thing that was used for insulation. Feathers and hair are both made of keratin. They're both modified reptile scale. Well, they're both modified scales, not reptile scales. Mammals have mammary glands. And again, this is the defining point. That first mammal that evolved mammary glands, that's the first mammal. That's the synapomorphy. This is a manatee, and I just like it. There's a big diversity in how mammals nurse, and their nipples are in their flipper pits. These things are so damn sluggish, algae grows on their back. Awesome creatures. We have those precisely occluding teeth. Again, any modern living group, that's right here. And our teeth are that in that diffidont condition. We have, only thing alive today shown this, the dentary squamosal articulation right there. That modern jaw, the lower jaw is made up of the dentary, nothing else. And 3 inner ear bones. That's a mountain lion. All right, 3 surviving mammalian lineages. And there's an evolutionary tree of them that I drew. Not very complicated. You know some of these mammals. You're in this group here, the advanced ones. 3 groups, and we're not going to worry about the rank. Class Mammalia, these would be subclass. I'm not sure what they are. Not worry about that. Got monotremes, got marsupials, got placentals. These are monophyletic groups. So, let's start at the bottom here. There's the basal mammal traits that define the base of the mammalia, and we would expect to see all of those in the most primitive group, and then none of the fancy stuff that comes later. Let's look at these guys down here. Monotremes. There are only 5 species of monotremes still with us. These are the most primitive mammals that are still with us. There's only 5 of them left. And where they live is Australia and New Guinea. And again, general biological principle, islands are like time machines. And in the isolation of those islands, sometimes very primitive ancient things survive. And Australia is a great example. There's Santa Cruz Island is a good example too of one thing. On Santa Cruz Island, there's a type of plant, a shrub called ironwood, and it's actually it's an ancient type of ironwood that's extinct on the mainland. But it's hanging on this beautiful population on Santa Cruz Island. You can see it there. That's not quite as impressive as Australia, but it's close to home. So, monotremes are the most primitive mammals we still have with us. Let's look at them. They're kind of cool. Now, remember, primitive does not mean that they can't be specialized. And remember, often when we look at primitive things, we see creatures with very specialized biologies, and that's probably one of the reasons they managed to survive, is they wormed themselves into a niche that no one else took from them. So we can have some fairly specialized biologies in a fairly primitive creature. So what are these creatures? Let's look at them. A few things about them. One is, alone among mammals, unique among mammals, and this is probably a primitive mammalian trait, is these guys lay shelled eggs. There's no live bearing involved. These 5 species lay an egg, and they incubate it like a bird does or like a lizard does, and a little baby hatches out of it. And as odd a piece of biology as this is, it's really hard to find photographs of it that I can swipe offline. And the ones I can find usually get pixelated when I blow them up. I don't know why there aren't pictures of that. So here's the diversity. There are 4 species of these little creatures called echidnas, spiny echidnas. The little creature has a kind of a, can you picture a hedgehog? Well, it looks like a hedgehog, doesn't it? The Europeans have these little hedgehogs, which is an insectivore. But it has kind of a hedgehog neck. So the hair is modified into spines, some of them there, kind of like a porcupine. Those are modified hairs. And very sensitive snout, very fine sense of smell, and seeks out small insects and grubs and worms and small animals. So it's grubbing around the litter for small animals to eat, mostly insects and arthropods. That's its niche. It's really, really good at it. Kind of anteater, but other insects, other creatures as well. Where they live, there's a species in Australia. I don't think it's found everywhere in Australia. It's obviously not found in the high deserts, but in Australia. And then there's 3 species in New Guinea. New Guinea's held on to a couple primitive things, too. That's the island of New Guinea. There's kangaroos on New Guinea, too. People don't realize that. So they're adorable, but fairly specialized biology. Little grub finder, beetle grubs, ants, insects, spiders, things like that. And protective armor in the form of these spiky hairs. And what North American creature does the same thing? Porcupines, yeah. Independent development. These are not related porcupines. Not related to hedgehogs either. And that's just a baby. They're goofy little things. Yeah.
Are they nocturnal?
That I don't know. We should look that up. I bet they are. Yeah. That's on. Yeah, when you have them at a zoo, they're in the night house, aren't they? Like I think LA.
Yeah, they have them in the nocturnal.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all. They have some in LA?
Yeah, they have in the Australian section.
Yeah,
they have
okay.
a nocturnal house.
Yeah, that's another place to take a field trip. Okay, we should have done that. The other one is one you've heard about, probably. That's duck-billed platypus. Again, a very primitive mammal, but a fairly specialized niche. These things live in Australia, in eastern Australia, in dense forested regions, and they live in rivers. They're aquatic. So it's a little like a beaver or a muskrat niche in some ways, and then it's aquatic and burrows into the banks. But its diet is rooting around in the mud with this very sensitive bill and eating invertebrates. It sifts invertebrates out of the gooey sediment. So muskrats are little carnivores like raccoons. Beavers are herbivores, so that doesn't match. But the habitat niche is kind of muskratty beaver kind of thing. You have flippered fins. Dense fur. The fur is really dense. I've handled specimens. It's really, really dense fur. I'm sure they made coats out of it for warmth when they were settling the area.
Do they have eyelids?
Do
they have eyelids?
I assume so. Yeah, all mammals have eyelids. He's just got them open.
Oh.
Yeah, I couldn't find a decent picture. That's a baby platypus hatching out of its egg. They're fairly secretive, and their biology is not extremely well known. They dig deep into riverbanks, and they nest and hatch their babies deep in riverbanks. And with habitat destruction and non-native creatures being introduced, they are in danger, or they're protected. I don't know how endangered they are, but they are protected. And that's a mom. And I couldn't find a better picture to show this, but that's a mom and her little babies, little hatchlings, called hatchlings, newborns. And we don't have nipples. The mammary glands are all over the mom's chest, and the milk oozes out like sweat. And little guys suckle it out of the fur. That's probably the primitive mammal condition. It's not being fed to them through a nipple. This is a very unusual trait for a mammal. It's the only mammal with this trait, and it's venom. We think of venom as a diapsid trait, right? Lizards and snakes, probably dinosaurs. There are no other venomous mammals, but the males have a spur on the hind leg, and he'll jam it into you, and apparently it's really painful. That's an unusual feature. And that's just a picture of a baby. fits inside your hand. Pictures like that, I put pictures like that to remind us that we, as wildlife, we're responsible. When we damage habitats, we're responsible for this, for caring for the stuff we damage. We're supposed to be, at least. When there's a story going around, maybe it's just one of the stories that people tell, but it's worth mentioning. This is a really unusual piece of anatomy. And people say, oh, it's a hybrid between a bird and a mammal. That's a stupid idea, but it's just a bird-like feature. When as Europeans were spreading out over the world in the 1800s, collectors would go with them. They would collect wildlife, and they would collect plant specimens and mineral specimens and animal specimens, and they would send them back to their home countries. And as Europeans went to North America, Australia, New Zealand, they were collectors, and they would stuff specimens in mountains. Darwin spent a whole bunch of time when he was traveling around the world in the Beagle collecting specimens, and they got shipped back for study. And when the first platypus specimen went back to the British Museum, which is in London, it was a stuffed specimen, probably with a skeleton. And the story is the curator of mammals opened up the box and looked at this mammal, and nothing like he'd ever seen before. And he thought the field workers were playing a joke on him, because they used to do that. They'd sew a monkey head on a fish body and say, we found a mermaid, and send it back. And apparently that first specimen at the British Museum, you can see where he took his pocket knife and he chipped away at that structure there, trying to find the stitching. Because he thought that was a bird beak stitched on some sort of mammal. Not. Okay. So, these guys define the primitive mammals. A very specialized biology, but that's the primitive condition. And now we go to more modern mammals. And we see some skeletal modification of the brain case. I don't want to go into details there. And the eardrum becomes vertical instead of horizontal. Vertical, like you have it there. So those are some synapomorphies here, and that leads to the rest of the mammals. And these mammals are called Theria. That's a word we don't need. I think that's a subclass. And the first group we cut into are called marsupials. And you've been to a zoo, so you've seen some marsupials. Marsupials don't lay shelled eggs. Marsupials have live birth, like we associate with mammals. But what is born is an embryo. It's not fully developed. And that little embryo crawls out of the mom's uterus and crawls up her belly and crawls into a pouch. And you know, marsupials have pouches on the front there. And the little guy or gal crawls into her pouch and finds a nipple there. We have nipples now. Grabs onto it and doesn't let go for 6 months. And the milk is just pumped into him or her. But that's an embryo. That's not a newborn. That's an embryo. Look at it. It doesn't have ears. Doesn't have fingers. And if you can see the rest of his body, doesn't even have hind legs yet. It's born as an embryo and does most of its development in the pouch. There are no shelled egg, but not exactly what we consider mammalian reproduction yet. And that's all the marsupials. And again, we go to Australia, New Guinea, and New Zealand to see marsupials. These islands are like time machines. And so there's a big diversity of them in Australia and some in New Guinea. And one of the interesting things about them is they evolved in isolation down there. And modern mammals, which are called placental mammals, we haven't got to yet, that's everything else. The modern mammals never had access to Australia until humans brought them there. So these guys evolved, and they filled all the niches that are available to them. Modern mammals evolved elsewhere and filled all the niches that are available to mammals. And we see lots of parallels. Again, convergence. You've got a wolf in the northern hemisphere. Australia doesn't have wolves. They have a marsupial that fills that niche called the Tasmanian wolf, but that's not a wolf. Basically a kangaroo that walks around with big sharp teeth and eats things. And we've got a small feline predator. We've got a similar thing in Australia. So where the niches are available, mammals have moved into them. It's just the raw material in Australia was placentals. The raw material everywhere else was, raw material was marsupials. Raw material here was placentals. I think I've got some examples. I just use these. There's the placental version. There's the Australian version. This thing's extinct, sadly. Went extinct in the 30s. The ranchers poisoned and hunted them into extinction in the 30s. Small, stalking predator. We think, okay, small cat predator. Well, there's the Australian version of that little predator. Yeah, look at that. Small little insectivore or seed eater. It's a mouse. In the rest of the world, well, there's mice in Australia. They're just not mice. They are filling the same niche, but they're little placental. They're little marsupials. And you see this little guy here? That's a mom and her babies.
Oh my.
Yeah, it can't feel good. But, did that. So like I said, islands can be time machines. South America, continental mass of South America, was a big island for a very long time, isolated in the ocean, separated from North America. So the evolutionary events that happened in the northern hemisphere didn't make it to South America. And this is where modern mammals evolved, in the northern hemisphere. And they diversified up here. And this was more like Australia. And then about 15 million years ago, the connection was made. And suddenly these habitats were open to all these modern mammals, and they moved south. And what we think was almost certainly a huge diversity of marsupials and maybe even monotremes disappeared as the more modern things pushed them into extinction. But there are some still surviving. There's no monotremes in South America, but there are marsupials. A small diversity of South American marsupials have survived into modern times. And these are some examples there. One of these, I think this one here, I don't know what it is, that thing that it's like you go in a pet shop in Beverly Hills and they have sugar gliders. It's one of these. That's an example of this. It's like a pet that Paris Hilton would have. But that's a South American marsupial. I shouldn't pick on Paris. So all this modern stuff went south, and some primitive southern things came north. And we do have a marsupial in North America. We only have one, and that's our possum. You seen these?
Yes.
They're nocturnal. They're very shy. Sadly, when you see them squished on the road, right? But that's a marsupial, and if you see a female, when I was grad school in central Oklahoma, in the crawl space above my little duplex, one lived, and I walked out one day and caught her kind of hanging in the bushes. She was trapped because she could either drop to the ground or climb back up. It was really weak, so she was kind of stuck there for a minute, hissing at me like you've never seen. They got more teeth than you can imagine. She had all these tails hanging out of her belly from her little possumlings. Okay, well that's these guys. The final group of mammals are called eutherians. We have therians, and we have eutherians, and we'll just call them placental mammals. And this is the height of mammalness. There's a deer there. There's almost everything you think of when you think of as a mammal. And I picked this picture as a doe, and she is with child, as we say, in a family way. Apparently the Queen of England doesn't let you say pregnant around her. You say in a family way. And there she is. So placental mammals do full-term development internally. There's no pouch. The fetus goes to full term and then is born as a baby or an infant, words we use for humans. And while it's born internally, it's born in internal structures. There's a structure there on this drawing here. We'll leave the details of the other classes. That structure is called the placenta. And the placenta is a construction of the mother's body, and it flows into the baby's circulatory system through the navel and reaches out, and it digs into the uterine wall. And so blood vessels from the fetus, blood vessels from the mother and the uterine wall, they don't connect. There's no direct connection between mother's blood and fetal blood, but they overlap. So there's diffusion in and out. You don't have a direct connection to your mother. You have this connection through diffusion. And so, when a woman's pregnant, she's eating for two, she's drinking for two, she's also peeing for two, she's doing osmotic and mineral balance for two. That's all through the placenta. And that's a structure that we haven't seen before. And so that's the unique structure of these mammals, not all sorts of skeletal stuff we won't worry about. Within the placental mammals, the eutherians, there are 17 different orders. Remember, phylum, class, order. And I just have a few of them here. We could touch upon a few of them as we walk through here. Give you an idea of the diversity here. Watching the time here. Let's take a few minutes here as we launch into the diversity. And I got fired. I thought I'm going to go print off some more slides. And I'll be back. So 5, 6, 7.